This is a Floating Voter Budget Special in association with EY Ireland. Hello, I'm Kevin Doyle and this is the Floating Voter Budget Special in association with EY. It is a year like no other, and with it comes a budget like no other. After years of austerity and a struggle to balance the books, the new Fianna Fáil, Gael and Green government has gone on a spending spree that would make Charlie McCreevy blush. There was millions and billions for businesses, housing, health, social welfare and the arts. But you can't please all of the people either, and the working man and woman might feel somewhat shortchanged despite the bonanza. To analyse the good, the bad and the absent from Budget 2021, today we have EY's Head of Tax, Kevin McLoughlin. Going through the political implications, as always, is I&M's Philip Ryan. And we're delighted to have the man with all the money. One half of what the papers today have variously described as the big spenders, the Rockefeller fellas, the budget boys, the blues brothers, the young defenders, and the odd couple. Finance Minister Paschal Donohoe, which of those titles do you and Michael McGrath like best?
Kevin, did you say the young offenders or the young defenders?
The young defenders.
I thought you were going to compare us to the young offenders. And given
have
that
you not seen the video?
Given that I've just seen the film and I have watched the television series for quite a while, I was struggling to see just what I would have done to merit a comparison with those two.
Well, this is Zoom, and we're obviously not all in the same room, but you obviously haven't seen the sun today, Paschal, because there is yourself and Michael McGrath as the young defenders.
Well, look, I suppose it's great to be still called young, Kevin. So I think I'll plug for that, I will. Very good. We'll get into, I suppose, the measures and everything that was in the budget. But I do want to start, I suppose, that it has been the calamity coalition in many ways. There has been error after error, and I think yourself and various colleagues have admitted that since the new coalition took hold. Yesterday did seem somewhat on a steadier footing. It seems like it was an awful lot easier to negotiate a budget with Michael McGrath than it was with Finian McGrath. Well, as the government was formed and in recent months, I have said that there were many different issues that developed along the way that we could have done better on, and I'll acknowledge that again now. But I would make the case to you that over the last number of weeks on really big choices for the country, the government has become and is very stable and coherent. In terms of the Finian v Michael question that you put to me there, actually Finian just texted me on the way to this podcast. But I worked really well with Finian.
To say what?
We'll have to wait till the end of the podcast before I tell you that, Kevin, just to keep you intrigued for a little longer. But no, he was just I guess recognising the scale of the budget. He was also very pleased that we made progress on disability, which is an issue that's very important to him. And then in terms of working with Michael, I mean, I've worked with Michael across the Dáil floor now, worked with him for a 4-year period. And across that period, I got to know him very well. And he is somebody that I believe I have and will work really well with. Between the two of us now, we're trying to make the decisions that we think will help the country.
We had Ono Vryn on this podcast last week, and we went through the Sinn Féin alternative budget. And the question myself and Philip kept coming back to was, how on earth are you going to pay for it, Ono Vryn? This is Sinn Féin economics. You've spent pretty much what he was looking to spend.
But in every budget that I've done before this, Sinn Féin have been looking to spend more, borrow more. Every budget that I've done before this, Sinn Féin have been against. So the budget that I did yesterday, Sinn Féin have wanted to do for every year and will want to do for every year coming up. That's the difference. As we begin our efforts to continue to reduce the deficit, which we're beginning for next year, they will oppose that too. The big difference is the budget that happened yesterday, the borrowing that we had to do yesterday, Sinn Féin have wanted to do for every year leading into this crisis, and will want to do for every year getting out of this crisis. They don't know and don't understand the kind of risks and issues that we need to deal with to look after our country, to look after jobs in our country, and they demonstrated that yesterday by the single transferable speech approach they used yesterday. And that is the big difference between the two political parties, the Fine Gael and Sinn Féin.
Well, you've added about 40 billion to the national debt. That's mega bucks, and some of that is going to be repeated in 2022 because some of this is day-to-day spending. So either you're going to have cuts or hope that there is some massive economic boom on the back of the COVID recovery. Like, we are in this now for the long game. What you did yesterday is not a flash in the pan. It might be the biggest budget ever, but we're going to be paying for it for a very long time, are we not?
The consequences of yesterday are going to reverberate for years and for budgets to come. But there's 2 points that make about that, Kevin. The first one is, if we didn't do what we had done yesterday, the employment consequences of that, I think, would have been pretty immediate as well. That would also have affected our national finances, our debt, our deficit, but have done so via the mechanism of so many people potentially losing their jobs or seeing their income fall. And you are correct to point out, as you've just done, that our level of national debt has grown and our deficit is bigger than I would have thought imaginable at the start of the year. But we are now very much similar to what is happening with borrowing and indebtedness of other countries that we would compare ourselves to. So this is fundamentally different to where we were a decade ago in many different ways, not least of which is the growth in our indebtedness and the growth in our borrowing is very much in the middle of the average of what's happening to other countries at the moment.
Kevin McLoughlin is somebody who deals with taxation issues day in, day out. Is there any way to get over this that isn't going to involve tax down the road? Are we putting off an inevitable tax hike, be it indirect or direct?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it'd be very tempting as a tax person to look at yesterday's budget and say that in the context of a budget of almost 18 billion, the tax element was obviously the much smaller part at around about 250 million net, that actually there isn't a whole lot in it from a tax perspective. And I suppose when you look at specific measures announced yesterday, that's probably broadly true. Obviously, it's a hugely significant budget. I think we'd all agree. And I think the Minister described it as unprecedented given the nature of the times that we're in. I think, the things that I suppose would be similar in a way to what we would have faced 10 years ago would be the fact that ultimately I think you're looking at a recovery here that has to be based on getting more people back working, which I think was one of the themes of the budget yesterday. And I think if you looked at what was substantially part of the bridge to try and bring the finances back into stability 10 years ago, it was that was a substantial part of that. I think tax revenues generally, bar let's say taxes that might relate much more directly to spending like VAT, have actually probably held up pretty well. And I think, Minister, you commented yesterday on the stability of corporation tax revenues. And how essential, I suppose, that is as part of kind of being able to fund some of the costs of defence against COVID. But clearly, I suppose, from if you do look into the future, I mean, there will be questions, obviously, as to how ultimately we look to kind of bridge the gap from a public finances perspective. And there is an open question, I suppose, in that respect as to what part or what role tax will play in that. And perhaps that's something for the Commission on Taxation, which again, I think was very much a part of the various manifestos around the time of the election. And I think was mentioned yesterday as something which would be formulated in the coming weeks.
I mean, what is an important point there, though, just to build on what Kevin has said, is that as we face into those questions, every other country is facing into them at the same point and in the same way. And one of the other ways in which this is different to where we were a decade ago is not just the degree to which corporate tax revenue has more than stabilised, indeed has grown. For me, the key feature of what has happened in our tax receipts this year is what has happened with personal taxation, where the taxes that relate to income, which income tax, PRSI and universal social charge, have held up in a way that is genuinely better than we would have thought possible at the start of the year. And
but on that point then, Minister, the working man and woman people who have been are still working and haven't ended up on a pandemic employment payment, haven't relied on the state, they'll probably look yesterday, or if they did any of the budget calculators that were on the independent website or that EY would have put together, they'll come away and go, God, everybody got something. He spent 20 billion. Everybody got something. And I'm basically being told, sure, you're lucky to still have a job.
Not only that, he's also suggesting that you should go dig into your savings and go start spending some of that money you've been saving up.
Well, Kevin and Philip, from representing the people that you're talking about and dealing with them a lot, as I am at the moment, I think what is also uppermost in their minds at the moment is where we're going to be with our economy next year and where we're going to be with our public health. And it is the case that this budget did not have the kind of personal tax reductions that other budgets that I've done have had. But it is because we're in the middle of a global, national economic challenge, the like of which we wouldn't have imagined. And sure, Kevin, you began the interview by asking me about how would we be able to afford what we're doing. If we were to do personal tax reductions now, we'd have to borrow more in order to do that. And then I'm sure I'd probably be doing a podcast with you and you'd be asking me, is it the right thing to borrow even more to fund personal tax reductions?
But sorry, can you just explain that one a little bit more in detail? That like you could have made choices though yesterday with all that money and funding to have reduced taxes in some regard. And in doing that, surely that would have resulted in people spending a little bit more because they have more disposable income, putting money into shops, into restaurants, into pubs, and rejuvenating the economy in that regard as well. So why are you suggesting that you would have needed to borrow more to do that? Could you not have used the portfolio or the package you had to do that in the first instance?
It would have then, if I had held my borrowing constant, it then would have been at the expense of many other measures that have been recognised as playing a role with our public or our economic health. And in order for me to preserve what we had done from a policy point of view, to do personal tax reductions on top of it would have required more borrowing. And I believe.
But I mean, you could have made different choices. And what
would you suggest that I shouldn't have done?
Did the arts really need all that money?
Well, I mean, we have to bear in mind now, and I mean, your paper has covered this.
Sorry, just hold on, Philip,
just to go back to what Kevin said earlier on, we won't speak over each other for the benefit of our listeners here. If you look at the artistic sector, look at how few people at the moment are not working in it anymore. I mean, leaving aside the reason of investing in the arts because of what it offers our society, there are also so many people who are in the arts sector who aren't working. And that's why that decision was made.
Yeah, sure. Okay, sorry, the other side of it as well, maybe you'll explain this one, and maybe it ties into what we were just talking about, is that there's a big focus in your package about putting money into this new scheme, this CRSS, the COVID restrictions support scheme. And it looks like a lot of money is going to be put aside for that. And maybe you could suggest, if we're saying like, well, why wasn't that some of that money used to give people tax cuts? But on the other side of that is that a huge amount of money is going towards supporting businesses. Anyone who sets up a business does so in the knowledge that they're taking a risk, knowing that it mightn't work out. It might go to the wall. Notoriously so poor. Well, restaurants especially are hard businesses. There's risks involved. And in saying that, no one expects the government to close their business down or a pandemic, but there is a risk. So it seems a lot of the resources are being put towards helping businesses who are hitting the wall due to this situation. But at the same time, money is being taken away in the coming months from employees who don't go into work every day in the knowledge that they've taken a risk. They haven't put an investment up front. They're just trying to go do their job. But they've all similarly lost their job, and they're now seeing resources stripped from them, or will be come January and April of next year.
I think one of the qualities of the independent paper over the many decades it's been read by so many of us is recognition of the value of the private sector and recognition of the risks that many take in creating work for others. What's fundamentally different to the other risks that you've just described, Philip, and you're right in how you've described it, is that if a business is failing at the moment, more than likely it's not failing as a result of the decision that was made by that person that owns or runs the business. It's in difficulty for two other reasons. A, the impact that the disease is having on that business in the first place, or it's a result of a public health decision made by government. So it's fundamentally different to the risk and return equation that you've just described a moment ago, which in normal times would be true, is that's been completely altered by public health decisions that the government is making in relation to the disease. So to use your example of a restaurant, if we didn't have this disease with us and a restaurant was in difficulty, you would ask the question then, and it would be a fair one, why should we put the money of the taxpayer into keeping a restaurant open? But of course, the reason why the restaurant is in difficulty now is the government is asking them to restrict their trading to try and help keep people safe. And therefore, in that context, that's why it is the right thing to do, to put the kind of money into keeping those businesses going that we can. But in turn, then, that allows us to have a better chance to keep the jobs of those who are working in that restaurant.
Last one on the personal taxation question, but you have always been an advocate before you were finance minister and since becoming finance minister of trying to tap away at income tax and change the bands. You have done it pretty much every other year you've had the role. Are you still an advocate of that? Do you want to go back to that? Do you hope to go back to that in budget 2022 to try and keep chipping away at the income tax bands?
I will continue to be an advocate to look at how we can change the point at which taxpayers pay the higher rates of income tax in USV. And when we get to our point in our economy that we can continue making progress in relation to that, I absolutely will. Because I believe it is so important that if people earn more through their hard work, through working extra hours of overtime, that they do have the opportunity to try to keep more of what they earn through working hard. But we are just in circumstances that are so difficult at the moment that I believe there wasn't the right course of action for the budget of yesterday.
I want to talk, we touched on it there a little bit, but the hospitality sector, which has obviously been devastated for a second time by the move to level 3 and talk of levels 4 and 5 in terms of the restrictions. Leo Varadkar said earlier today on the radio that the stay and spend scheme is pretty much useless at the moment because people can't leave their counties and they can't go to a pub or a restaurant. So will there be changes to that, given that very few people think we're going to get below level 3 for most of the winter at this stage? Is there anything you can do with spend and save? I know it wasn't in the budget yesterday and you did we'll talk about the VAT changes in a minute, but what's the point in this big scheme that was announced only a few weeks ago if it's useless?
He didn't say it was useless, unless he did another interview during the day that I didn't hear. I heard the interview he gave, and he said that it wasn't working in the way we wanted. I don't think he said it was useless.
No, useless is my word, yeah. But, that's what the average person listening would have taken from it.
But it's not what he said. And what he said, I think, from hearing the interview, is that it wasn't working in the way we would have intended, wasn't having the effect, and that's true. When we launched the plan, we were hoping we'd be in a position that people could continue to travel across counties and they would be able to stay in hotels within our country, all over our country. The reason why we have preserved it as it is because of my hope that as we continue with our work to deal with this virus, that we will be in a position that, for example, people will be able to eat within their county and maybe use this stay and spend as a way of accessing savings from it. Or later, when we're able to travel across our country again, they'll be able to use it then. But it is fair to say that at the moment, it's not working in the way we would have hoped for, because obviously the opportunities to have a weekend away in different parts of our country or go away for the midterm are not going to be there in the way we would have hoped.
What were some of the things that you were hoping to do with it? There was a bit of a debate around possibly changing it or expanding it. What were some of the ideas that were being tossed around before you eventually rested with just leaving it as is?
Well, the things that we looked at would have been where we are with the discount that you're able to access and stay and spend, and whether there is a case for that be more. The duration of the stay and spend, it's in place until early next year. Should we extend it beyond that? But ultimately, the difficulties that Kevin touched on there a moment ago are real. And I think if I had came out and announced, the expansion of the Stay and Spend scheme, I think all of you would be putting pretty obvious questions to me regarding why I'm doing it. It's something that I believe will work, but clearly decisions have moved against it working at the moment because of what's happened with public health.
Kevin McLoughlin, was there enough in what you saw yesterday to get the hospitality sector through the winter and into hopefully a better period, maybe from St. Patrick's Day on again? Or are we looking at big job losses long term?
Well, I think the observation I suppose I would have in terms of the various measures that were introduced yesterday, and hospitality, the kind of reduction in the VAT rate being a case in point, I suppose recognise that the situation to date has been pretty fluid. So I think at the early stages of the pandemic, we tended to see measures introduced for a period of months, obviously, until we could see, where things were going and how long those measures needed to be in place for. I think there is a bit of a difference in that respect. I think in terms of a number of the measures that were introduced yesterday, which I think look to be designed to give that longer term certainty to certain sectors as to what the environment would be, rather than just kind of playing it forward for 3 months and kind of begging the question then. The reduction in the VAT rate, I think, is a good case in point of actually giving clarity and certainty to that sector until essentially the end of calendar year 2021. And I suppose that will allow businesses like them to kind of plan better, on a longer term basis, rather than thinking, okay, well, is this a 3 month stopgap and then have to think again, depending on how COVID, etc., and other factors work out, or do I have a kind of more clarity in the longer term to plan better?
So just to pick up on that very briefly, this was something that was uppermost in my mind in March and April when we began to deal with this disease, Kevin, which is how we would have the ability to do different things at different points in time. And you may remember, for example, when we announced the first round of measures there many months ago now, they were, as the other Kevin said a moment ago, they were, time limited. And there was, some criticism of what I did then, asking, was it enough? And I always had in mind the need to be able to respond in phases and the need to be able to do different things at different points in time. And that is why I do hope some of the things that we announced yesterday, by doing them now, might have a bigger effect than if we had done them earlier in the crisis.
I want to touch on working from home, because one of the reasons that we're obviously all in 4 different parts talking to each other over a computer is that pandemic reason. I think, Minister, you're the only person who perhaps is working from your office most of the time at the minute. We had to produce all our budget coverage from journalists in their own box rooms and bedrooms yesterday. Kevin McLoughlin, would a big company like EY, where obviously you have everyone from graduates to very high paid executives, would you have liked to see more on the working from home side of things yesterday? Because presumably, even when the pandemic hopefully ends, this is, I hate the phrase, but the new normal.
Yeah, I think a number of the measures that were discussed yesterday, I guess, have been there, for a while. They're not necessarily new, bar a kind of very explicit reference to broadband, which will obviously be kind of welcome. That
people can set their broadband off their tax at the end of the year, basically. If
they're essentially kind of forced to work from home, if you like, as a consequence of the pandemic, yes. So I think in that sense, I think, I suppose employers would be very conscious of not just the supports in that respect. So, because I think it's a much broader thing than just simply kind of the fiscal answers, the allowances, the kind of tax deductions. Is probably just exactly as you described the question, almost have people got the right working environment to be able to work effectively from, let's say, non-office environments, if that's where they've typically worked. So I think that has forced kind of businesses to look critically at, the kind of physical infrastructure that people have to work within. And it has definitely kind of caused broader issues. We talked before this started about, for example, a lot of graduates, who wouldn't be from Dublin, who moved to Dublin to join us, for example, will essentially have probably moved back home at this stage. So trying to keep pace as employers with all of those kind of trends, actually probably taking up more time in a way, and providing the right infrastructure has taken up more time than necessarily focusing on the allowances, if you like, that might be available, or the tax deduction piece. But I think there's been a lot of coverage over the kind of early months of the pandemic anyway, in terms of various different webcasts that would have created strong awareness of what people's entitlements would have been. And I think what yesterday did was probably just took the opportunity to put it up in lights and to make the broadband question pretty explicit.
Employers do have a say, though, a big say, Minister, don't they, in terms of what allowances people can get to offset some of the costs that come from working from home. Did you consider tightening that up to try and give workers better rights in the area?
But workers who are working from home at the moment have the ability to determine what receipts they want to put in to allow them to claim expenses that are deductible for the purposes of doing work. So that discretion always sits with workers. And what I'm really conscious of is I think we do need to look at what are the trade-offs involved between working from home and working from the office. And I mean, you painted a picture of it earlier on in your question there to Kevin in two different ways. Firstly, the fact that we have people who will be working from their kitchens, from their spare bedrooms, from their living rooms. And also the fact that for a company like EY, at this point in the year, you could have hundreds of people that are coming into offices for the first time after finishing up education, either in school or in college. And if public health guidance allows it, and I hope it will next year, like I want to be in a place where we have a better balance on this than we have at the moment. If we can do better in dealing with this disease, don't want, you and Philip working from your home for the rest of your careers, because the ability of people to meet in an office, to socialise in an office and to learn from each other is what makes a skills economy. And we are a skills economy.
I was going to ask, can I go back to the office and leave Philip at home? Would that be 50-50 that way?
I think I'm in sensitive territory even trying to answer that. So I might leave that to Philip. But I'm just trying to make the point that particularly if you're starting your career, the ability to be in a collective environment has a huge effect on the development of your skills, your career, what you can earn, what you can contribute to our economy. And before we make any further decisions regarding how we change the balance from a tax point of view between working from an office and working from home, like I want us to, if our public health guidance allows it to, get to a place where we can have a different balance than we have today. It mightn't be possible for people who work in I&M or who work for EY to be in an office 5 days a week early next year. But I hope it might be possible at some point next year for you and Philip and Kevin, maybe to be in the office a day or two a week and be together.
Can I just ask as well about you said about claiming tax credits for working from home? I think you touched it on there, and you were talking about it's up to the individual to what they can claim. Like, are we talking home heating costs? Are we talking electricity costs? Is there things like that people are entitled to claim from revenue?
The Revenue Commissioner will be, issuing guidance in relation to all of this so that it can be absolutely clear what people can claim. I think the issue that has been there with utilities, which is why it's difficult to do, gas bills, for example, is it's very difficult to be able to say what portion of heating a home, for example, is attributable to working from home.
Well, if you take 8 hours of the day and do some sort of equation and say, look, those 8 hours I was in work and
I'm going to leave that off. I'm going to leave that to the Revenue Commissioner to figure out if that can be done. Whereas with you, for example, with broadband, I mean, there has been a surge in the number of people now that are having to work from home digitally. And that's why I just wanted to note that the Revenue are going to issue guidance now that will make the issue of broadband clearer. One
of the biggest problems for people who want to work in an office and work at all is childcare. And with Catherine Zappone as minister, as an independent minister, she seemed to twist your arm every year and get quite a big package. Nothing like that yesterday.
Well, of course, the key decision that has been made in supporting the childcare sector, Kevin, is the fact that they are deemed to be eligible for the employment wage subsidy scheme. So even though the revenue of the childcare sector has not gone down in the way that every other sector that's on the EWSS has, when I brought in the legislation for the wage subsidy scheme, I deemed childcare to be the childcare sector to be eligible for the full subsidy. So I did that in recognition of the need to support the viability of the sector. And maybe because that decision was made before the budget, it didn't perhaps get the profile that it might otherwise have had. There has been a big increase in the funding for childcare overall. It's at €640 million per year, enabling, for example, the rollout of the first year of the National Childcare Programme. And I know now what Roderick is doing is he's taking a step back and saying now with all that has happened with this pandemic and how it's affected the sector, he wants to make an assessment now of what we might need to do in the future. But the big intervention is supporting the sector through them being on the wage subsidy scheme.
Renters is the other one. And I know it feels like I'm picking out all the gaps that were left there, but a lot of complaints that nothing there. And I know the property market, the rental market, everything is in a mess at the moment, but rent still ain't cheap.
I appreciate that. But in relation to the protection of renters, we have in place, as you know, legislation that goes up to the middle of January that offers a higher level of protection to tenants than they otherwise would have had because of all the difficulties that you're referring to. And Minister McGrath yesterday made more money available for the PRTB to oversee that legislation. And we also put in place the funding now to make the first big step in the availability of cost rental accommodation. But
it is meaningless, though, really, to people who are handing over stupid amounts of money, myself included, to live in fairly, adequate surroundings.
That kitchen looks quite nice, Philip.
Yeah, to put money into it, but it's still crazy what renters have to pay and how much they've been left behind throughout the last years. And it's not just this year; it's year in, year out. There's no real attempt to address what the problems are, the amount people have to hand over for rent, and it stops you saving. We know the old arguments; it stops you saving for a house. And even though a mortgage would be cheaper, and you would actually have more money in your pocket then. And it is frustrating to see how little attempt is done to do anything. And I know there's the idea of a rent freeze and it's unconstitutional and all those arguments, but there must be a bit of imagination used to help people out in these situations.
But that's why we extended the Help to Buy scheme to exactly deal with the issue you've identified of people not being able to save for a mortgage because of their level of rent. I mean, the Help to Buy scheme now, with the changes that we made in July, gives far more help to help people get to the level of having a deposit to purchase a home if that's what they want to do. And we have put that in place now up to the end of next year. And again, I know all of the difficulties that are involved in paying levels of rent that are too high for too many. But we have extended the protections that were brought in, most of the protections that were brought in during the emergency up to the end of next year, end of next January. And we've retained a far strengthened Help to Buy. And I would make the case to you, Philip, that as we now begin to actually roll out cost rental units and apartments in Dublin next year, that I hope will be what will make a difference to the issues that you've just raised.
And what about the central bank's rules? They're still obviously an issue in some respects, especially the amount of money you have to have, the 3-to-1 valuation. But also, and it's been talked about a few times, is there no way of rent being taken into consideration when those rules are being looked at, that you can show that you can save a certain amount and that can contribute to possibly enable to draw down more in a mortgage?
Well, that is a regulatory decision that is made by the central bank, not by me as minister or by the government. And I have to respect their ability to set those rules. But what I've done to try to help with the issue you're referring to there is a significantly strengthened Help to Buy, so that for those who are looking to save a deposit, they have the ability to get more of that deposit back through getting their own taxes back.
Philip is starting to sound like one of those callers into the Claire Burns show who has all his personal finance issues.
Well, wait till I get on about my 2005 BMW that you're going after as well.
Kevin McLoughlin, just before we wrap up, as someone who has studied many budgets and been very insightful on them, what would you give this one out of 10? There's nothing to compare it to for a start.
Well, I think it is a truly exceptional budget, and it is. It's very different to, I think, to any of the budgets that we've had, really going back probably to the years immediately after the global financial crisis. It is interesting, actually, because I think generally, other than what you might have predicted, the feedback, I think, broadly has actually been pretty positive. I think while a lot of it obviously was focused very much on putting the right supports and spending to support different sectors and different businesses, I think there was a bit of forward looking to it. I think there was a nod to innovation and a nod to how innovation might play a positive role in the future development of the economy and creating jobs. And I think of particular note, there was a bit of creativity, I think, around how better to maybe tap into some of the European sources of funding, to invest in high innovation businesses. I think the notion of, let's say, supporting more the digital gaming sector, kind of linking that back into kind of the film and animation space here as areas where we would probably see the potential for pretty significant high end jobs growth from an employment perspective. So I don't think it was all in the moment as such. I think there was an eye to the future. I mean, there clearly are questions which I think we probably all knew there would be around, the longer term affordability, what might happen in the coming years around taxation, etc. But I think broadly, actually, certainly what we would have heard, was positive in response.
You'll take that, Minister, I'd say. What's next? That's the budget. Public sector pay talks around the corner.
Yes, they will be, and Minister Michael McGrath will be leading them.
There's that hospital pass.
Well, I've done 2 different rounds of them, and I'm well aware of all of the work that goes on in them and the challenges, and I'll be working with Michael on all of that. The things that are coming up for me now very quickly, there's 3 things: the finance bill, number 1; number 2, working with the Taoiseach on the National Economic Plan; and then number 3, the Commission on Taxation and Welfare. And all of those things are coming up now in the next few weeks.
And of course, we have to let you go because you have a cabinet meeting coming up this evening to discuss what has happened in Northern Ireland today in terms of restrictions. Can you give us any insights into what will be discussed there? I suppose the schools question, I suppose, is the one a lot of people are looking at very closely.
I genuinely can't, because I've been into Shannon all afternoon since the cabinet meeting has been set up, and then I came right from Shannon to this. So I know we're due to discuss this evening. I'm sure both Kevin and Philip are in contact with many of my more informed colleagues, and you already have the agenda probably, and maybe even the potential decision. But I know what we'll be discussing is obviously what has happened in the north and what that will mean for neighbouring counties and elsewhere.
That's one question on that. Most of the talk is that 3 of the counties would be where the cases are obviously a little bit worse than others around the border: Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal. But does it make sense to just do those and not include others, like including Louth, I suppose, would be an obvious one, and a little bit of Leash, I think, is.
Well, I don't know what would be the decision that would be recommended to us by the Taoiseach and Minister Donnelly this evening. I'll get my cabinet paper soon and I'll be able to see it. But all I'd say is that I think in some of the debate that has happened regarding moving to
sorry, I should say Leitrim, not Leash.
I was actually afraid to say anything because I was trying to work out in my mind what direction you were going in, Philip. And imagine the people of Leash might have got quite a surprise if they found themselves in those measures.
I know.
But being in level 3 is a huge deal as it is, and has a huge effect on lots of different employers. And if we're going to potentially move other parts of the country to up a notch from that up to level 4, I'd like to keep that as limited as we can. But one way or another, the people of Leash will obviously be in my mind as we're weighing that up.
Last question on this, and then we will let you go study those cabinet papers. But the schools proved contentious in the north. The executive seemed to debate it back and forth well into the night. They have now decided to take an extra long midterm. Has there been those same kind of, I don't know if disagreements is the right word, but the to and fro on schools in the cabinet here, or is everybody convinced and guaranteeing that the schools will stay open?
There's been an awful lot of debate on our schools and so many other decisions we've had to make. I mean, you know, your own paper covered off the different options in relation to the midterm. And I want to do all we can to keep our schools open because it's for all the reasons all your listeners will know. But one feature of what has happened over the last number of weeks is decisions that we're making about public health are now seen in a kind of a very rounded and comprehensive way, because we are far clearer on what really big decisions in public health mean, because we've had to live with it earlier on in the year. And that is the background to the decision the government made there a week ago about moving to level 3 as opposed to a higher level for the country. Okay,
well, we will let you go away and study that and prepare for that row at Cabinet if it needs to be had, Minister. Is that Red Bull or some sort of sugary drink you've been drinking during this podcast? It's slightly concerning.
This is a no sugar Diet Coke.
All right.
I thought it was a can of cider.
I think producing that in front of Kevin Doyle and Philip Ryan at 3:44 in the afternoon, the day after the budget, would give you no end of
on you at all.
Well, you mightn't pass any judgment on me, but you'd still have to report us.
A much deserved can of cider.
Well, he's no longer showing us the can, but we'll take his word that it is a non-sugar Coke. Minister, thank you very much for giving us your time. I know it is a crazy 48 hours for you, and that is our lot for this special budget episode in association with EY. Thanks to Minister Paschal Donohoe, to Philip Ryan as always, and EY's Head of Tax Kevin McLoughlin. We'll be back next week when we will be talking more about the fallout from the budget and I suppose where we go from here with COVID.
You've been listening to a Floating Voter budget special in association with EY Ireland.